Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Oliver Colville.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join me in condemning the outrages that have shocked the world in recent days. The siege of the cafe in Sydney ended in tragedy, but was accompanied by heroism so typical of that great nation, and we all grieve with the Australians today. What happened several thousand miles away in a school in Pakistan is utterly heartbreaking, a massacre of the innocents which has left the world numb. The world stands head bowed with Pakistan today. Words can comfort, but words cannot defeat the men of violence. So let this be the moment when the whole of Pakistan, when every nation comes together and says enough, we will act together to defeat this evil in our midst. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in sending our warmest Christmas wishes to all our armed forces deployed across the world, in particular in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and in West Africa. We're forever indebted for the sacrifices that they make on our behalf.
Mr. Oliver Colville.
Can I associate myself with my right honourable friend's comments on the evil atrocities which took place both in Pakistan and also Australia, and also the best wishes to our armed forces who may be serving abroad. Today's unemployment figures showed that in the last quarter, the South West has the region with the largest increase in employment in the United Kingdom. To continue to realise its full economic potential and to deliver the City deal, does my right honourable friend agree that Plymouth needs a faster, better, more resilient railway line, as laid out in the South West Rail Task Force three-point plan, which was a discussion last week with my right honourable friend, the member for South West
Well, my honourable friend has campaigned over and over again for the important improvements in these rail links, and he knows what is being done to help the South West in that regard. I received a presentation from the task force, and we are going to take forward each of their three-point plan in the work that we do in future to make sure there's real resilience and better services for people in the South West. On the issue of unemployment, the figures in the West Country are welcome. In his own constituency, the claimant count has now fallen by 42% since the election. And what these figures show nationally, they show employment up, they show unemployment down, they show the claimant count falling for the 25th consecutive month. And what I think is an important moment for our country is unemployment is now below 2 million and wages are rising faster than inflation, something I'm sure will be welcome across the House.
Mr. Speaker, I want to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to those murdered in the appalling massacre in Pakistan. Even as we have become accustomed to tragic events, this slaughter of innocent children in their classrooms has shocked the world. We stand in solidarity with the grieving families and the people of Pakistan and in the fight against terrorism. I also join the Prime Minister in condemning the sickening terrorist attack in Sydney, and our condolences go to the families of those who died and to the Australian people. And I also, like the Prime Minister, pay tribute this Christmas to all our troops serving around the world. They do our country proud and they show the utmost courage and bravery. Mr. Speaker, the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility, established by the Chancellor to give independent expert advice, claims that his plans, and I quote, take total public spending to its lowest share of national income in 80 years. Why does he believe the OBR has joined the BBC in a conspiracy against the Conservative Party?
Well, first of all, can I welcome what the Leader of the Opposition says about the atrocities that have taken place? Can I also welcome his welcome for the Office of Budget Responsibility? We still remember the days of the fiddled forecast, the fake figures, and all that we had to put up with. But if he's going to quote the OBR, he might want to read the complete quote, and let me do that for the benefit of the House. It says about our spending plans, the closest equivalent in the national accounts implies that by 2019-2020, day-to-day spending on public services will be at its lowest level since 2002 and 3 in real terms. Now, 2002 to 3, Mr. Speaker, in my memory, was after 5 years of a Labour government when the honourable gentleman was an advisor in the Treasury. Presumably, he's now going to tell us it was a time of appalling poverty and deprivation. But I don't seem to remember that being the message at the time.
Miliband.
Confused. He spent 4 years saying we spent too much. Now he's saying we spent too little. And the reality is he can't run away from the Office of Budget Responsibility figures, because they say, and this is the full quote, that it takes total public spending to its lowest share of national income in 80 years. Is he really saying they're wrong as a proportion of national income?
The percentage of national income will be roughly the same as it was in 1999 after 2 years of a Labour government. The fact is this, I think that after 7 years of economic growth, we should be having a surplus. We should be fixing the roof when the sun is shining. Is the Labour leader really saying that he doesn't think we should run a surplus ever? Is that what you're saying?
If he's just a little bit patient, in 4 months' time, he'll get to ask the questions and I'll get to answer them. Now, let's talk. He knows what's happened. He knows what's happened is that the mask slipped in the autumn statement. He's been revealed for who he really is. Let's talk about the scale of the cuts to get to the 1930s vision. They are over £50 billion, more than the entire amount we spend on schools, half of what we spend on the NHS, and significantly more than in this Parliament. Is he really pretending that cuts on this scale won't do massive damage to frontline services?
Of course we have to make difficult decisions. We have every day since taking over from the shambles that we inherited. And everyone can now see that his pretense, which lasted for about 1 week of caring about the deficit, is over. This is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies says about his policy. Under a Labour government, there would be much more borrowing and therefore more government debt. They haven't learnt a single thing from the last 4 years. More borrowing, more debt, more taxes, all of the things that got us into this mess in the first place.
He's borrowing £207 billion more than he planned, and he's broken his promise. And the difference is, we'll cut the deficit every year. He wants to go back to the 1930s. And if that wasn't bad enough, he's got £7 billion of unfunded tax cuts on top. Now, before the last election, Mr. Speaker, he said this: you can't talk about tax reduction unless you show how it can be paid for. The public aren't stupid. So, what is it going to be? Further cuts in public services or a rise in VAT?
What this government has shown is if you get on top of the national finances, if you grow the economy, you can cut taxes for 26 million people. That's what we've shown. Isn't it interesting, Mr. Speaker, on this of all days, not a word from him about the fall in unemployment. That is the truth. Remember the predictions. They told us there'd be no growth, then there was growth. They told us there'd be no jobs, then there were jobs. They told us the jobs wouldn't have pay ahead of inflation, now the jobs have pay ahead of inflation. They told us the deficit would go up, the deficit has come down. They've got absolutely nothing to say about their economy because they've been wrong on every single count.
Mr. Speaker, him crowing everything is fixed. It may be fixed for his Christmas card list, but it isn't fixed for far many people in this country. Now, he didn't really answer the question on VAT, did he? This is what he said before the last election, on the 5th of April 2010. We have no plans to put up VAT. Then, barely 2 months later, he put up VAT from 17.5% to 20%. He's got £7 billion of unfunded tax cuts, a deficit plan he can't meet, and we know he's got form. Will he now categorically rule out a rise in VAT?
We don't need to raise taxes because we've got a plan. We've got a plan for efficiencies in spending. It's the party opposite that doesn't have a plan. He asks what has changed for real people over the last year. I'll tell him. 588,000 people have a job this year who didn't have a job last year. Long-term unemployment's fallen. Youth unemployment's fallen. You would have thought the Labour Party would welcome those things. But, Mr. Speaker, it is Christmas. We should all enter into the Christmas spirit. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've had my Christmas present a little bit early. This is the document. This is the document being sent to every Labour MP. And In case they haven't had the time to read it, let me advise them, if they go to page 16, be patient, if they go to page 16, it's there in black and white. Managing the economy, it says. The Conservatives have a 17-point lead. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, maybe at Christmas, Mr. Speaker, I hope at Christmas he gets to reflect on his year. He's lost 2 members of Parliament to UKIP, he lost 26-2 in Europe, and he brought a whole new meaning to the phrase conviction politician when Andy Coulson went to jail. The truth is, he's given up on compassionate conservatism. They've been exposed for who they really are. His plan for the 2020s is to go back to the 1930s. It isn't about balancing the books, it's about slashing the state. And in just 4 months' time, that is the election choice.
What this has shown is on a day when unemployment has fallen, inflation is down, our economy is growing faster than anywhere else of a major economy in the Western world, he's got absolutely nothing to say. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I almost feel sorry for Labour MPs. They can't talk about the deficit because it's fallen. They can't talk about growth because it's rising. They can't talk about jobs because we're increasing them. They can't talk about immigration because they've been told not to talk about immigration. They can't talk about their leader because he's a complete waste of space. No wonder for Labour MPs this year it's a silent night.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's hit order. The voice of South Dorset must be heard. Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, may I concur entirely with the Prime Minister's words on the appalling tragedies that are unfolded around the world, bearing in mind the continuing success of our long-term economic plan. Could my right honourable friend please reassure the House that, bearing that in mind, that any future cuts of our armed forces will not happen under a future Tory or coalition government?
Minister.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that you can only have a strong defence budget and strong defence forces if you have a strong economy and a clear long-term economic plan. Now, our defence budget is the biggest in the EU. It's the second largest in NATO. We meet the 2% guideline of GDP. And what I can tell him is that because of the success of our economic plan, we're able to commit to over £160 billion of investment in equipment and equipment support over the next 10 years. And that's why you're going to see the aircraft carriers, the Type 45 destroyers, the future frigates, the A400Ms, the hunter-killer submarines. We're seeing incredible equipment rolling off the production lines in our country to help to keep us safe.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The terrible slaughter of the innocents in Pakistan yesterday shocked the world, and is another example of obscene atrocities being visited upon children in various parts of the world by these barbaric forces. Another example was the attack on 200 school children who were abducted in northeast Nigeria in April of this year. At the time, the government and other governments pledged their support to do what they can to assist in the hunt for those children. What can the Prime Minister do to provide reassurance about that and the commitment of British experts to assist?
Prime Minister.
Well, what we do in all these cases is see what expertise and assets that we have that we can help bring to play to help those governments that are trying to combat these problems. So in Nigeria, we did, for a period, lend the expertise of our fighter jets with their Raptor pods in order to provide imaging to try and help find the Chibok girls, and we continue to work with the Nigerian government in every way that we can. With Pakistan, again, we believe that the Pakistan government must confront terrorism in all of its forms, and it is taking steps to do that. And I think today is the day when we should really redouble our support and our efforts, and the whole world should do the same, to say that if the Pakistan government wants to continue to act to root out terror, and none of this can be justified, it has the support of the whole world, Britain included.
Neil Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the businesses, the schools, my Festamain team, the college, in organising a week-long Festival of Manufacturing and Engineering in my constituency? It was opened by the Prince of Wales. And does he agree with me that by focusing on innovation and productivity, this government will deliver more exports and higher standards of living?
Certainly join my honourable friend. I mean, as people might know, this is an annual week-long festival championed by my honourable friend, and it showcases local manufacturing success stories. I remember when I visited his constituency, we watched a 3D bike being printed in metal. It was extremely impressive. What we need is to continue with the long-term plan, which is delivering a more balanced recovery with manufacturing growing as well as construction, as well as services, and our commitments to increasing the number of apprentices, to helping companies with R&D, to keeping tax rates low. All these things are delivering a very strong manufacturing success rate for Britain.
Dame Tessa Jowl.
Mr. Speaker, millions of people will work extra hours this Christmas in difficult and often low-paid jobs so that they can send money to relatives living abroad. Their remittances to sub-Saharan Africa alone account for more than donor aid. But their money transfers will be hit by fees and charges, often as high as 15%. 5 years ago, the G8 committed to reducing this transfer tax to 5%. So will the Prime Minister join me in calling on the transfer companies to cut their charges for Christmas as a first step to meeting the G8 promise to families in some of the poorest countries in the world?
Prime Minister.
No, well, the Right Honourable Lady is absolutely right to highlight the importance of remittances when we look at the amount of money that goes from our country in the form of remittances to countries like Somalia and others in sub-Saharan Africa in desperate need. They actually outweigh by a significant amount the amount of aid that we're able to give to those countries. So yes, we should look at every way we can, and we are, about how to help these remittances take place. There have been problems in the past with making sure that we apply money laundering and other potential issues to those, but we're looking hard at what we can do to keep the charges down.
Mark Garnier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the characteristics of the decade leading up to the financial crisis was the £1 trillion increase in household debt. Will my right honourable friend assure the House that no future long-term economic plan will be financed by a debt bubble inflated on the backs of hard-working households?
No, my honourable friend is absolutely right. I mean, one of the changes we've made since the crash is to put in place proper arrangements for the Bank of England to call time on the level of indebtedness in the economy, and to make sure that financial regulation, including regulation of the mortgage market, for instance, is properly put in place. So that is one of the important lessons. I have to say to the party opposite, one of the other important lessons is that when you've had a long period of economic growth, you should be trying to pay down your debt and aiming for a surplus. That is what fixing the roof when the sun is shining is all about.
Nicholas Brown.
I welcome the fall in unemployment, but it's still too high in the northeast of England. Will he tell the House and my unemployed constituents what the principal candidates are for working age benefit cuts?
Well, first of all, let me join him in welcoming the fall in unemployment. It has fallen in every region of the country over the last year. In the northeast, over the last year, unemployment is down by 11,000, and that is welcome. In terms of this issue of addressing the costs of welfare, I think we should be very frank about this. As I was discussing calmly earlier with the Leader of the Opposition, whoever is Prime Minister after the next election is going to have to make public spending reductions. Now we have a choice. If you leave the welfare bill as it is, or if, like Labour, you vote this afternoon to add £2 billion to the welfare bill, that is what they're talking about this afternoon, £2 billion on welfare, you have to take that money out of the education department, or the health department, or policing. We think you shouldn't do that. We think, yes, there are reductions in welfare that can be made. We will make them. That will keep taxes down and make sure we can have good public services.
Mr. Speaker, for people starting their careers, or for newly married couples, or for others, the prospect of owning their first home is a much desired but very difficult step. So what is the government doing to help young people in my constituency make that positive move?
Well, I think there are two vital steps that we can take. The first is to go on backing the Help to Buy scheme, which has helped thousands of people in our country, I think over 70,000 people now, because what it does is enable people who are working hard, who earn a decent salary, who can afford the mortgage payments, to take out that mortgage and buy that home because they don't need such a big deposit. That's the first thing we should do, and we shall continue with that. The second, as I announced on Monday, we want to build starter homes that are 20% below the market price. These should be homes, not homes for rent, but homes that young people can buy. They will be reserved for people under the age of 40. And again, this is for people who work hard, who want to get on and do the right thing for themselves and their families. Under a Conservative government, they'll have homes they can buy.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was contacted at the weekend by a constituent who told me that his 78-year-old mother was left bleeding on the kitchen floor from a fall. And it took almost an hour and a half for the ambulance to attend. Isn't this indicative of the health service under this government? And what is the Prime Minister going to do? What is the Prime Minister going to do to ensure the pressures are eased on the ambulance services?
No, what is indicative of the NHS under this government is the fact there are 1,700 more paramedics and 200 more ambulances than when this government came to power. And the reason for that is we didn't listen to the party opposite, who said that it was irresponsible to increase health spending. Instead, we've put £12.7 billion into the NHS. Now, where any ambulance trust falls down, that is a matter of serious regret and should be looked into very carefully, and I'll look into this case as I do with any other.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is not unhelpful to discuss voters in Basildon and Thurrock's concerns about border controls and immigration? And anyone who thinks that is out of touch, and perhaps they should be moved on.
Well, I think my honourable friend is right. You know, our job as elected politicians is to respond to people's concerns and address them. And this is why I fear for the Christmas of Labour MPs. What are they going to talk about? This says that immigration, well, that's out of the question. They can't talk about that. The figures today, there's not much talk about unemployment because it's plummeting. They've got nothing to say about the deficit. They spent precisely 1 week telling us the deficit mattered before pitching up today and now spending £2 billion on welfare. I think leadership issues they'll want to skip over quite quickly. I think it's going to be a very difficult time for them.
Nia Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, I don't know if the Prime Minister will have received any Christmas cards featuring husky dogs, but perhaps he could tell us whether he agrees with his right honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, who has said that the UK's groundbreaking Climate Change Act should be scrapped.
No, well, I haven't checked all my Christmas cards, but I don't think I've had one that she suggests so far. But I spent an hour and 3/4 in front of the liaison committee yesterday discussing the issues of climate change, where I think actually the legislation we have in place is delivering cuts in carbon emissions. And what you see under this government is the world's first green investment bank, beating the rest of the world in doing that. And we have doubled the amount of investment going into renewable energy compared with the previous 2 parliaments. That's what's happening under our government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm that due to the long campaign led by my honourable friend for Enfield North and, of course, the government's long-term economic plan, that my constituents this winter can have an extended urgent care and in the new year can look forward at long last to the rebuilding of Chase Farm Hospital?
I know how hard my honourable friend has worked for this outcome, and I'm happy to say that Enfield Clinical Commissioning Group has announced an extension to the opening hours of the Chase Farm Urgent Care Centre. This will be in place until the local urgent care review reports. And further, I can confirm that the government has set aside £230 million for the redevelopment of the Chase Farm site. So that is very good news for the people of his constituency and his borough in London. What we are doing, because we have a long-term economic plan, is investing in local health services.
Tom Blenkinsop.
Today there are 2,500 fewer nurses in our NHS compared to May 2010. Why?
Well, obviously, he hasn't been studying either the documents he gets sent by his own party or the figures. Today, actually, there are new figures out on the NHS, and I'm delighted. Let me give him the new figures. We were saying there were 2,000 extra nurses under this government. Mr. Speaker, that was wrong. There are 3,000 more nurses under this government. We were saying Until very recently, there were 7,000 more doctors under this government. I'm ashamed to say that's wrong too. The figure is 8,000 more doctors under this government. The NHS is performing well because we put the money in and made the reforms.
Sir Tony Baldry!
Nobody Ed smiling. He's laughing, the rest of them look sad, aren't you, Ed? They look totally glum.
Can I commend my right honourable friend to some advice from Karl Marx, who, when the European correspondent of the New York Tribune observed that these vital interests should render Great Britain the earnest and unyielding opponent of the Russian projects of annexation and aggrandizement, and went on, in the arrest of the Russian scheme of annexation, the interests of democracy and of England go hand in hand. Does my right honourable friend agree for the United Kingdom, Europe, the West and indeed the whole world, one of our most important foreign policy priorities for 2015 should be to see that Russia behaves as one would expect a member of the Security Council to behave in the interests of international
Prime Minister.
I very much agree with my right honourable friend. I haven't spent as much time studying Karl Marx as he has, or perhaps even as the Leader of the Opposition has. I don't know what goes on in Camden these days. But anyway, what I would say is, in this respect, Karl Marx was right, that the interests of the United Kingdom and democracy do go together. We should stand up very firmly against the Russian aggression that has taken place. We led the way in Europe in making sure there were sanctions, and what the combination of the lower oil price and the sanctions are showing, that I think it isn't possible for Russia to be part of the international financial system but try and opt out of the rules-based international legal system. That, I think, is what is being demonstrated, and we should keep up the pressure.
Well,
the levy control framework, which is the total cost added to energy bills and taxation by green targets, will rise from 2.3 billion in 2012 to 9.8 billion in 2020, at a time when many households are struggling to heat their homes. Does my honourable friend think this is fair?
Still an honourable friend. The levy control framework has been fixed, and it sets the overall amount of investment that can go into renewable energy schemes, many of which are providing jobs for constituencies up and down the country, often particularly on the east coast of our country, not least in Hull, where an enormous amount of investment is going in. I welcome that investment, and I'm not sure what his view is.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that if he and the Chancellor deliver their plans for the economy, they'll take public spending back to the level that was being delivered by the then Labour Chancellor, but only because he was bound by an election pledge to stick to my economic which that he had inherited from a Conservative government.
My right honourable friend gives us a very important historical perspective. And it does come back to this point. I mean, the party opposite seem to be now basing their entire economic policy on some throwaway mark on the BBC at about 6:10 on a Monday morning. The truth is, what is being envisaged is getting public spending back to the level it was in 2002 when he was sitting in the Treasury. So I'm afraid his whole idea, like all his economic policies, has collapsed within 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the most recent OECD report, number 163, on income inequality, shows that the UK economy would be 20% bigger if the tax policies had redistributed income to the bottom 40% of citizens. Can the Prime Minister resist the temptation to waffle and consider seriously that his policies and those of Chancellor Scrooge over his 5 years, by rewarding the rich with tax cuts and hammering the middle and low-income people with rises in their cost of living, are not only...
Order! The Prime Minister!
I was just about getting the hang of it, actually. Look, I think the problem The problem with the Labour Party's attempted narrative is it simply isn't true. They talk about inequality, but inequality is lower than it was at the election. They talk about poverty, but there are 600,000 fewer people in relative poverty than there were at the election. They talk about child poverty, but there are 300,000 fewer children in relative poverty than at the election. This afternoon, we'll be talking about children. There are 390,000 fewer children in households where no one works than there were in 2010. Those are the facts. They may be inconvenient, but you ought to have a look at them.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, charity workers Alex and Becky Ewing, were last week facing a tax bill of more than £8,000 as they moved into their first home. As reported in the excellent Salisbury Journal, Mr. Ewing declared that he was blown away by the Chancellor's statement and will be giving some of the £4,500 stamp duty that he unexpectedly saved to local charities. What message does last week's announcement send to first-time buyers this Christmas?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. The message that the autumn statement sends is that we are on the side of people who work hard, who want to get on, who want to own their own flat or their own home. And we've cut the stamp duty for those families so they can afford those houses. What a contrast with the party opposite, who want a new homes tax.
Sheila Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, who's paying £12 a week from a £72 a week income on the bedroom tax, was less than impressed to find out that actually annual spending on housing benefit is now £4 billion higher than it was in 2010. When is this Prime Minister going to tackle the real causes of the increase in housing benefit spending, which are low wages and high rents?
The point is, the Labour Party have opposed every single change to welfare, every single change to housing benefit, and this afternoon they're going to vote in this House for an extra £2 billion of welfare spending. All this in the week when they're meant to be telling us how much they care about the deficit. It is completely incoherent, and that is why the British public will never trust the Labour Party with the economy again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recent announcement of the build of the Glossop Spur and the consultation to extend this bypass around Tintwistle has been widely welcomed across the areas of the High Peak constituency. However, there is some scepticism about it actually happening, given the previous Labour government shelved their scheme in 2009. Can my right honourable friend therefore provide me and my constituents with some reassurance that a future Conservative government can be relied on to deliver this scheme?
I can certainly give my honourable friend that assurance, and I know he's campaigned tirelessly to improve the roads in his High Peak constituency, and that these Transpennine routes are absolutely vital. So the reason we can give him that assurance is because we have a long-term economic plan that's delivering the economic growth that we need, that's seeing our deficit come down, and because we've made that success, we can commit to these road schemes.
On a closed question, Liz McInnes.
Question 15.
This government is using a range of measures, including cold weather payments, warm home discount and an increase in pensions. We will improve the warmth of 1 million homes by March 2015. This provides real help to older people by taking money off their bills and insulating their homes to ensure that they're able to keep warm this winter.
Ms McInnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's an interesting response, but my constituent, William Sullivan, has written to me to say how appalled he is that last year over 18,000 people in England and Wales died simply because of the cold. What guarantee can the Prime Minister give me that no more of my constituents will suffer in the cold this winter for want of a properly insulated home?
What I'd say to the Honourable Lady is that every excess winter death is a tragedy, and the 18,200 last year were too high. But I have to say to her, that is actually half the level of the excess winter deaths there were in 2008-9, when the leader of her party was the Energy Secretary. So we will continue with the long-term patient work of the warm homes discount, keeping the winter fuel payments, the cold weather payments and the schemes to insulate people's homes. That is the right way forward.
Last but not least, Sir Malcolm Bruce.
Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm that NHS spending under this coalition government has risen by 4% in real terms? This has been passed on to Scotland, where spending has in fact been cut by 1%. Can he also be aware that Grampian has a 70 million two-year shortfall in funding, and consequently the responsibility for the crisis in the health service in North East of Scotland lies firmly with the Scottish Government, led until a few weeks ago by Alex Salmond, the MSP for East Aberdeenshire? My honourable friend is absolutely right. We have increased spending by £12.7 billion. That translates into a real terms increase. So Scotland and Wales have had the extra money to spend, but Labour in Wales chose to cut the NHS rather than to invest in it. And in Scotland, the SNP government has not translated the full amount of money. And that is why, when you look at figures for things like accident and emergency, yes, we need to do better in England, but our performance is still well better than it is in Wales or in Scotland or indeed in Northern Ireland. And the moral of this story is you need a long-term economic plan and a Conservative-led government to deliver these advances.
Order!